The river is a frothing, raging beast filled with jagged chunks of ice, ready to trip them up. Blake struggles with the long oars, trying to steer the cataract. But the swift current offers little control. He shouts to his father, Neil, to hold on tight. The small craft is swept around a bend, and that's when they see it. A solid, 2-foot-high mass of ice, stretching from bank to bank. They're on a collision course with the ice wall, and there is nothing they can do to stop it. June 5, 2003. Blake Stanfield, a 38-year-old Alaskan resident, is a doctor, competitive runner, and outdoor enthusiast. Growing up, he and his father Neil spent countless hours backpacking and camping together. To celebrate Neil's 65th birthday, Blake has planned something special: a rafting trip through the wilds of Arctic National Park. Concerned that the trip might be too rugged, Neil suggests doing a guided group rafting tour instead, but Blake stubbornly rejects the idea. He doesn't want to raft with strangers, he just wants to spend time alone with his dad, a decision he'll come to regret. The Stanfields charter a plane, and a bush pilot drops them off on a gravel bar along the North Fork of the Koyukuk River, about 200 miles northwest of Fairbanks in Alaska's interior. Their plan is to take a leisurely 6-day rafting trip down 90 miles of winding river, stopping to hike and camp along the way. Eventually, they'll follow the middle fork of the river and end up in the town of Bettles. After being dropped off at the gravel bar, the two men enjoy a pleasant afternoon. They plan to camp here overnight and set out the next morning. Blake uses the time to rearrange their gear, knowing there will be rapids about 4 days downstream and wanting to ensure everything is securely strapped down. They're well prepared with a rifle and camping gear, though they don't have a cell phone or walkie-talkie. Blake slips a small knife and a waterproof lighter into his pocket. Little does he know, this is a life-saving decision. Day 1. It's a clear, warm Friday with temperatures in the 70s as the Stanfields begin their journey. The Koyukuk River is wide and calm, stretching over 100 feet across. Blake sits behind his father in the 2-seat cataract, a hybrid between a raft and a catamaran, with 2 pontoons connected by an aluminum frame. Blake controls the raft with 2 long oars. Enjoying the warm weather, he's dressed in just shorts and a t-shirt, skipping shoes. Neil, on the other hand, wears a t-shirt, long johns, waist-high waders, and boots. Thankfully, both follow water safety rules and wear life jackets. The first few hours of rafting are pleasant, filled with casual conversation. They chat about various things, including how much they're enjoying the untouched wilderness and how it feels like they're the only 2 people in the world. In fact, they might very well be the only visitors in Arctic National Park. Blake had deliberately booked the trip 2 weeks before the river officially opened, ensuring they would avoid other rafters. Slowly, the river begins to narrow and pick up speed. The Stanfields start to notice large chunks of ice, both in the water and along the banks. But they aren't too concerned. For 6 months of the year, the Koyukuk is frozen solid, but during the summer it melts. However, this early in the season, patches of ice still remain. As they continue downstream, their concern grows. The ice chunks are getting larger, covering vast sections of the river. The current moves faster and faster. The once languid river has transformed into a frothing, raging beast, filled with treacherous boulders and jagged chunks of ice, ready to trip them up. Blake struggles with the long oars trying to steer the cataract, but the swift current offers little control. He shouts for his father Neil to hold on tight. The small craft is swept around a bend, and that's when they see it, a solid, 2-foot-high mass of ice stretching from bank to bank. They're on a collision course with the ice wall, and there is nothing they can do to stop it. Seconds later, their right pontoon slams into the ice, flipping the raft upside down. Blake, Neil, and all their gear are thrown into the river. In the blink of an eye, both men are swept under the ice shelf. The glacier-cold water is shocking, like thousands of tiny knives stabbing into their skin. The jagged frozen river overhead bumps against their skulls and scrapes skin off their faces. Thankfully, the men are pulled into an air pocket beneath the ice, allowing them to lift their heads above the water and gasp for breath. As soon as he can breathe, Blake breaks down, crying and apologizing to his dad. They cling to each other, trying to hold on, but the current is too strong, and soon they're both swept away. Blake thinks he's going to die, and he worries about his family. Suddenly, he breaks free from beneath the ice and into the open water. He manages several deep breaths and looks around for his dad. Just as he spots him, they're quickly dragged under a second ice slab. The first slab was about 30 yards long. This one is much bigger, at least 100 yards, and this time with no airspace between the ice and the water. Panic sets in as Blake frantically searches for air, his lungs burning. He can barely see in the blue-green light filtering through the ice. In his mind, he is screaming with panic, but there is little he can do. Just as his vision begins to fade and his lungs are about to burst, he pops up from under the ice wall once more. Blake tumbles through the rushing river, his skin catching and tearing on the ice and rocks. Gasping for breath, he swims toward the bank and manages to reach it. Fueled by adrenaline, he scrambles ashore. As he tries to catch his breath, he frantically scans the water and spots his father being dragged downstream. Neil is holding on to one of the oars, struggling to keep his head above the water. Blake races barefoot along the shore, determined not to lose sight of Neil. Neil crashes into a large icy ridge. He manages to hold on tightly and pull himself halfway out of the river onto the ice. Lying there dazed, the wind knocked out of him, he struggles to regain his bearings. Meanwhile, from the shore, Blake waves frantically and yells at his father, urging him to swim for the safety of the shore. Neil can't hear his words over the roar of the rushing water. Finally, Neil eases off the ice and tries to swim for the bank, but the current drags him down. Blake shouts encouragement, but Neil's struggling with exhaustion, fading fast. Blake looks around and finds a 10-foot dead spruce branch. Blake carefully leans out over the water and holds the branch out to his dad. Thankfully, Neil is able to grab it, and Blake pulls him ashore. Neil lies on the ground, dazed and shivering. He's in the early stages of hypothermia. In the blink of an eye, their incredible rafting trip has turned into a nightmare. Blake remembers the lighter in his pocket. He quickly gathers some loose tinder and twigs and starts a fire. He urges his father to take off his clothes, but Neil is shivering uncontrollably and can't manage to remove them. Blake strips off Neil's shirt and aggressively cuddles him skin to skin as they wait for the fire to catch. Gradually, Neil stops shivering. As they sit by the fire, they assess their situation. They're about 60 miles from Bettles with no food and no raft. The only gear they have consists of a lighter, a small folding knife, a map, 2 life vests, 2 whistles, the clothes on their backs, 1 oar, a pair of boots, and a pair of waders. Having somewhat dried their clothes and warmed up by the fire, Blake and Neil walk away from the riverbank in search of a better place to shelter. They leave the oar propped up in the gravel pointing downriver as a signal for searchers. Blake walks quickly, aware that they're in a precarious position and that night will soon fall. Neil moves more slowly, feeling annoyed, and complains to his son, asking him to slow down. While he's concerned about finding a safe spot, his aging body isn't keeping up as well as he'd like. He's still recovering from an accident several months ago in which he broke his ankle, and stumbling over the rugged terrain is a strain. About a mile from the river, the Stanfields discover a dry V-shaped gully with a fallen tree across it. They forage for moss, branches, and dried grass, piling them on the tree to create a rough shelter. Evening is approaching and soon it'll be chilly. Blake climbs a ridge to get his bearings. From up there, he spots his raft, drifting in one of the river channel's offshoots, hopelessly out of reach. As dusk falls, Neil and Blake huddle around a small fire. Blake believes their best chance for survival is for him to hike out and get help. It would take 6 days before anyone would come looking for them if they didn't arrive in Bettles. He worries about staying in one spot, where rescuers might have a hard time finding them, while they grow weaker by the day. On the other hand, Neil argues that if they stay put, they can forage for food and rest. Throughout the night, father and son snuggle together in the rough shelter, taking turns in front of the fire. The person behind hugs the one in front to share warmth. Neil shivers into a fitful slumber, while Blake hardly sleeps at all, consumed by worry. The cold and the bright sky don't help. This close to the Arctic, it gets chilly, but it doesn't darken much when the sun dips below the horizon. Day 2. The next morning, Blake is resolute. He is determined to walk 60 miles to Bettles. Neil believes Blake's plan is too dangerous, reminding him that the first rule of the wilderness is to stick together. He questions how Blake plans to cross the river. Between them and Bettles lies the confluence of the Koyukuk and Tenayuk rivers. There's no way to reach the town without crossing it. Blake insists he'll figure it out. Neil thinks Blake is making the wrong choice, but he knows how stubborn his son can be. Reluctantly, Neil gives Blake the waders and insists he carry the knife and lighter. Before Blake leaves, he helps gather extra tinder for his dad, so Neil can keep the fire going until his return. Father and son exchange I love yous, neither wanting to voice their terrible thought that they might never see each other alive again. Around 10:30 a.m., Blake sets off wearing his father's wading boots and long johns, armed with the knife, lighter, whistle, and map. Neil is left with the waders and neoprene socks. Blake begins to climb a ridge to get a lay of the land before heading south. While the map gives him a general idea of his route, the lack of specific landmarks makes navigation difficult. The rugged brush soon gives way to uneven tundra, littered with ankle-twisting dips and rises. Later, Blake would describe it as walking on bowling balls. As he walks, he sings to himself and blows his whistle to make noise and alert any bears in the area. At one point, Blake spots a black bear, but thankfully he's downwind. He quickly ducks behind a tree and makes his escape. As Blake continues walking, he unexpectedly comes across a massive sleeping grizzly bear. Surprisingly, his noise-making hasn't disturbed the bear. He quickly decides to make a wide detour around it. Late in the afternoon, Blake arrives at the bank of the Koyukuk. The river is wide and flowing fast, but it doesn't seem nearly as daunting or impossible to cross as his father has suggested. After psyching himself up and carefully wrapping and securing the map, photographs, and lighter, Blake plunges into the bone-chilling water. The icy cold takes his breath away. He struggles briefly against the current but ultimately manages to swim across the river. Afterward, Blake builds a fire to dry his clothes. The swim has sapped his strength, and he has a long way ahead of him, but he feels good about the progress he's made. He figures he's walked close to 20 miles. He settles down for the night. Meanwhile, Neil is working hard to keep his fire going. He spends the day gathering wood and improving his shelter, while frequently blowing his whistle. Neil moves slowly. His body aches as if it's been tumbling in a washing machine. His hands are raw, and scabs have formed on his face and body from various scrapes with the ice shelf. On his first night alone, Neil dozes for an hour at a time, waking to gather wood to fuel the fire. He is determined to not let it go out. Day 3. Most of the third day is a repeat of the second. Blake continues his strenuous hike while Neil catches naps in between tending to the fire. Both men's mental health begin to suffer as they worry about each other's fate. As Blake hikes on, something suddenly stops him in his tracks. The Koyukuk River. It's vast, filled with ice chunks, and the current is swift. What he crossed yesterday was merely a tributary of the river. His father was right. There is no way across, and it's impossible to reach Bettles without crossing the main river. Blake lies down on the bank feeling demoralized and exhausted. He hasn't had anything to eat in over 36 hours. He notices some sand spiders and manages to catch and swallow a couple whole, hoping to gain a bit of protein. However, they seem more trouble than they're worth. Blake takes a nap, but is awakened by the sound of raindrops. He worries that the rain will drench his father, putting him at risk of hypothermia once more. Thankfully, the rain clouds quickly pass. Blake walks along the river and finds a wide open space. He gathers driftwood and builds a signal fire, but the smoke isn't very noticeable. As he settles down for the night, he wonders what to do. Should he hike back to his father's camp, or is he more likely to be rescued where he is now? Meanwhile, Neil has struggled alone with his thoughts throughout the day. Running low on energy, he feels disheartened and consumed with worry for his son. Neil's second night alone is worse than the first. The vast sky and cold make him feel small and isolated. He crouches close to the fire, staring into the flames, hungry and achy, consumed by worry for Blake. Suddenly, a rustling in the brush catches his attention. Neil yells to scare the creature away. The lack of rest and fear begin to take a toll on him. He finds himself shouting crazy things. "I am the king of this valley. Everyone who lives here at my pleasure. You want to see me? You have to go through my nights." At night, he wakes from a doze to find his shelter ablaze. A spark from the fire has flown over and caught his meager shelter on fire. With no way to extinguish it, he has no choice but to let it burn. Day 4. Overnight, meltwater has flooded the river, leaving Blake damp when he wakes. He moves his fire a little further inland and spends the day tending to it while exploring the riverbank. He keeps an eye out for any planes flying overhead. It's hot with no shade from the blazing sun, but Blake stays put. The only way someone will see him is if he's out in the open. Meanwhile, Neil continues to forage for tinder and feed his fire. Day 5. It's now Tuesday, 5 days since the men's accident with the ice wall. Luckily for Blake, some sightseers ask bush pilot Dirk Nikic to take them on a flight tour of the area. As Blake tends his fire, he hears something. It's a plane. He looks up in the air and spots it. His ears weren't playing tricks on him. The plane is real. He jumps up and down and watches the plane. Has it seen him? He waves his life vest frantically in the air, hoping the pilot can see him. He jumps and keeps waving until the plane dips its wings and banks toward him. The pilot has seen him, and this is his way of waving back before flying away. Pilot Dirk returns to the airfield and checks with the National Park Service for visitor records. The news isn't good. 2 men were on a trip, but Dirk only saw one. Time passes, and 3 hours later, Blake has begun to wonder if he hallucinated the plane. Suddenly, he hears the buzz of another aircraft overhead. He waves and shouts, and this time the plane drops a bag of supplies and a walkie-talkie. Blake quickly grabs the radio and explains the situation. Dirk relays the coordinates to the Park Service to initiate a search for Neil. They launch an aerial search but unfortunately find no sign of him. He's not in the gully where Blake left him. Frustrated and scared, Blake pleads with the pilots over the walkie-talkie, insisting his dad has to be there. Day 6. Early the next morning, an Army helicopter lands and rescues Blake. Once on board, he directs the pilots to his stricken father. When the rescue helicopter lands and Neil climbs aboard, he's surprised to find his son strapped in, waiting for him. They reunite and joke about how they both look like hell, covered in dried blood, dirt, and scrapes. Although exhausted, bruised, and famished, neither of them has any serious injuries, and they will go on to make full recoveries. Later, Blake learns that they probably would have never been discovered if he hadn't attempted to hike to Bettles, where he ended up on the bank of the river was under a common flight path, while where his father was camped wasn't. A week after the Stanfields' misadventure, all the ice in the river had melted.